It is Hallow Eve, the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain, the last night of the harvest before the first day of winter. When the veil between our world and the spirit world is so thin that the living and the dead can pass through. I want to tell you something that happened to me, a true story. It happened 33 years ago, this very night. I was at a wake, a traditional Irish gathering the night before a funeral. And I left the wake house just after midnight. I had a journey of about 50 miles ahead of me. It had been raining all day. And as I left, the rain wasn't taking time to come down. It was arriving in sheets, and the wind was blowing a hoolie. And I was travelling along a road called the Frosses Road, which at that time had the dubious honour of being the most dangerous road in Ireland. And this was due in part to the fact that it cut across the great expanse of the Garry Bog. A peat bog in Ireland is an open area covered in heather, and underneath the heather are layers of peat laid down over thousands and thousands of years. And when the peat gets wet, it swells up, and when it gets dry, it contracts. And so to lay a road over the top of the peat bog is a tricky business. But unfamiliar travellers, when they see that long, straight road, they are tempted to speed. And sadly, they're often caught out by the many humps and hollows caused by the subsidence of the peat. If they're very fortunate, they may land in the soft heather of the peat bog. But this road was lined with pine trees, planted on purpose in the hope that their roots would knit together and hold the road up. And so, unfortunate drivers were more likely to hit a pine tree with predictable outcome. So I was driving along this road very carefully. My main concern was surface water. I had been told that aquaplaning was the big danger on a night like this. As I drove down the road, this wet mist was swirling around everywhere, and my windshield wipers were barely fit to cope with the amount of rain that was coming down. In the mist, I saw a figure on the left-hand side of the road, arm extended, moving up and down slowly like this in an obvious appeal for assistance. I was in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't another light, house, car for miles. No sane person would have been out on the road walking on such a night. I drove closer to the figure, and I'm ashamed to say I kept driving. Before you judge me too harshly, let me explain. It was the mid-1980s. Our country was in turmoil. There was murder and mayhem on a weekly basis. People were nervous, including myself. It was not against my better judgment that I drove on, but it was against my conscience. And it got the better of me about a mile down the road. I thought whoever that was on the road on such a night must be in dire need. So I turned the car and I went back, thinking that it must be an accident or some such event. When I pulled up to the figure, I realised it was an old woman. I leaned across and unwound the window. She leaned in and said, "God bless you." "Get in," I said. The wind and the rain were howling in round the car, but she didn't seem to be able to manage the handle. So I jumped out and I ran around. I got her in the car and I came back round again, and by the time I got to the driver's door, I was drenched. I could feel the wet material of my trousers sticking to the backs of my legs. My hair was dripping. Before the interior light went off, I glanced across at the old woman. She didn't appear to be wet at all. She was wearing a long woolen overcoat and a woolen hat. From the sleeves of the coat protruded thick, bony wrists, and she had huge, bare, big, farmer-type hands with which she held on to an old Victorian carpet bag like grim death. And she stared straight ahead of her. If I were to ask you to describe a fairy tale witch, you would describe this woman. She was old. She had a big hooked nose. She had thin lips, and her skin was a golden brown colour, like the seaweed we find all around our coast here. And I imagine that it would have the same cold, leathery feel to it. Her face was so lined, so wrinkled, it gave her a very ancient, careworn appearance. As we drove off, I said, "That's a terrible night, isn't it?" She didn't answer, except to give one long, wearisome sigh like this. I thought she must be exhausted. So we drove on a bit further. And then I tried again. I said, "That really is a terrible night." Again, she never answered, except to sigh. "Where are you going on such a night?" I said to her. Again, she just sighed. But then she said, "Belfast." Well, by this stage, the hair was standing on the back of my neck. And I started to speak talk with nerves. I said, "Belfast is 70 miles away in that direction. I couldn't take you there tonight. I wouldn't have enough fuel. I'm going in this direction. I could take you to the next town, which is Ballymena, and I could drop you maybe at a hotel or something like that, but I couldn't take you to Belfast." And then eventually I ran out of breath and things to say. And we drove along in near silence, except every few minutes she sighed. I could only take my eyes off the road for a second or two at a time, and when I did, I glanced across at my strange passenger. She held on to that bag and stared straight ahead. And then I got this strange feeling, you know, the one when you're being watched, closely scrutinised more like. And I glanced across again, and it still gives me shivers to think on it. When I looked at her, her face was right there, 2 inches from mine. I drew back. She came forward with that big hooked nose. I had to bring my eyes back onto the road again, and when I did, she rasped in my left ear, Be careful. Well, I must have subconsciously been trying to drive faster to get away from this danger. When I looked at the speedometer, it said 70 miles per hour, far too fast for the road conditions. I took my foot off the accelerator and I planted it on the brake, and within 50 yards I had halved my speed. A second later, we struck what could only be described as a river of water that had spread across the road. I lost control momentarily. The engine started to splutter. A wall of water came over the car. We couldn't see anything but water. Within a few seconds, it fell away from the window and the windshield. I revved the engine to keep it going so as we wouldn't conk out in this water. And eventually, we got through. A rush of adrenaline went through my body. My legs were trembling. If we had hit that water at 70 miles per hour, we would not have survived. I was shaking. We drove from there to the next town, and I and my strange passenger never exchanged a word. When we got to the town of Ballymena, I found one of only 2 hotels there. First one I could get to. I dropped the old lady off at the side of the road. And as I drove off, I felt relief. I was upset. I felt guilt at leaving this old lady by the side of the road in the middle of the night, but it was 1 o'clock in the morning, legs were like jelly, and I just wanted to get home. As I drove home, I thought about all the things that had happened. I thought about how wet I was. I thought about how dry she looked. And of all the strange things that happened that night, this perhaps was the strangest. When I got home, my seat was damp from my having been soaked, drenched in the rain for a few seconds. Her seat was perfectly dry. I had a restless night's sleep, and the next morning I drove the 50 miles back up to the north coast and the funeral. As we walked along behind the coffin, I spoke to an old mourner, a friend of the family, who was a local of that area. I told him of my strange experience the night before, and he just, yes, that'll be the Bog Woman, he said. The Bog Woman? Is she a local? Is she right in the head? I said. Oh no, he said. She's a ghost. Well, I telephoned the hotel. I asked, had anyone checked in? They said no. Not that night. I told my mother the whole story, and she said, guardian angels come in all disguises, son. Well, I have thought about the Bog Woman many, many times over the years, and I've never been able to come to a logical conclusion as to who or what she might have been. And the story might have ended there, except that in 1992, I read an article in a local newspaper. It was one of these kind of thought for the week sort of columns, written by a Christian contributor. And the gentleman said that one Hallow Eve, he had been driving along one of these country roads off the Garry Bog. It was getting dark. There was a steep hill coming up. And as he drove along, he saw a figure at the side of the road. He stopped and realised it was an old woman. He was in no mood to pick up a passenger because he was going through a terrible tragedy in his life at that time, and he did not want to speak to anyone. But when he saw this old woman in the middle of nowhere, he felt compelled to offer her a lift. As they drove along, he said in his article, the conversation was awkward to say the least. She kept repeating this phrase, "May the Lord bless you," over and over and over again. Because of the circumstances he was in, he took some comfort from this repeated blessing. And he told her so. And after a few miles, she asked him to stop and let her out. He was reluctant to do so, but he agreed to her wishes. He drove off. And as he looked in his rear-view mirror, there was no sign of her. He reversed back because he was in the middle of nowhere. Where was this woman going to go? He searched everywhere, around on both sides of the road, and he could find no trace of her. Well, I was so anxious to meet this man. I contacted the newspaper. They put me in touch with him. We had a very long conversation about our equally strange experiences. I was so hungry for an explanation, but he did not offer one, except to refer me back to his article in which he had quoted the Bible, a letter from St. Paul to the Hebrews, which said, "Be kind to strangers. You may be entertaining an angel and not know it." Good night.